As I said, in our configuration where we don't have a radius proxy situation, the connection request policies are something that are perhaps a little less interesting than our network policies over here just below. These network policies also have two that are available out of the box. You can notice here the connections to our RAS server, which is actually one that we saw early ago, back in that earlier course, when we needed to just set up that initial master toggle switch for our locally authenticating RAS server. That is the first item here in the processing order, which then takes us all the way down here to our third item in the processing order, which is the VPN connection that we configured back in that last module. It's here where we can then add in additional configurations for how we want the network experience to be for the users whenever they end up making a connection through this NPS server and also through the remote access server that they're connecting through. Well, let's take a look here at the properties of what we've configured thus far. Our policy is enabled. It's also set to grant access here. We don't care about user account dial-in properties, obviously, and we're connecting up here through a remote access server. There are a variety of other just different kinds of experiences you can configure here. If you had a terminal services or remote desktop services environment, there is a setup here for remote desktop gateway. You could do the same thing for a DHCP server. A little later on, when we talk about NAP, we will configure a health registration authority configuration. There's also an HCAP server here if you're setting up the HCAP protocol in your environment. If you're dealing with 802.1x, there is the unspecified network access server, which I don't believe, at least it doesn't specifically state that it's on this exam, but I would at least have an awareness of some of the special characteristics that have to do with 802.1x, either wired or wireless configurations. We won't deal with them here, but if you have those networking devices sitting out in usually your internal network, you can use this NPS server as a way to amalgamate all that authentication for those devices into a single location. Now, let's just continue here with our VPN configuration that we've done so far and take a look here at the different conditions that can be set for the users coming in. Now, you should remember this when we configured that wizard back in the last module, that obviously we need this to be for VPN, and we also set up the domain users as the Windows groups, or effectively the people that are allowed to connect in through this VPN device. But we could add in, just like before, other different characteristics that define which machines and which users can come in. So machine groups, for example, Windows groups and users groups are all available here. We'll skip over HCAP here because we're not dealing with that here for this exam, but we could also set up day and time restrictions, so days of the week and hours of the day that those people would be able to come into our network. For NAP, we'll talk about that a bit later, but some of the other configurations here with NAP that determine how healthy a client needs to be before it's allowed to access this internal environment. And then the same things that we saw before, so your IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. The authentication type that you've configured. Right now we've set up PEEP right here, the protected EAP, as our authentication method. So do you want to limit based off of that authentication method? Do you then want to further limit off of the encapsulated authentication methods that happen to be inside of EAP? These are PEEP and MSCHAP v2, the protocols that we talked about earlier. Also, what are the frame protocol, PPP versus SLIP, and the service type, PPTP versus L2TP or SSTP. All of these should be fairly familiar at this point as the different kinds of protocols and tunnels that you're creating when the users are connecting in. Down here again are the Radius client properties, so not the actual connecting client, but the Radius client, that is your remote access server, your calling station ID in the case of a server telephone number, the name or address of the client vendor or the RAS vendor that's associated, and again down here the gateway configurations if you're setting this up for a gateway situation. So all of these again can provide conditions for determining who should be able to access this environment. Once they're in the environment, it's here where we can go about defining the constraints, or effectively, how do we want to ensure that that person coming in has the correct configuration so that they're secure enough to make it into our environment. We talked a bit about the authentication methods here and enabling MSCHAP v2 and then also PEEP is the EAP type that we'll take a look at later. Do we want to set things like idle timeout and session timeout so that a user that's not making use of the connection will be automatically shut down and locked out of the connection after a certain period of time? For dial-up users, if I have people that are dialing into this environment, do I want to ensure they're only dialing to certain phone numbers? Again, with day and time restrictions here, as well as the NAS port type that will be coming in. In our case, this would be a VPN if I wanted to lock it down to just this VPN experience. All these further constrain things down so that they can apply the settings for what these users will see or use and make use of whenever they come in. So what framed protocol, PPP versus SLIP? What service type are they using? Any vendor-specific information? Some NAP information here as well. And then down here are some of the routing and remote access configurations that were identified back in the exam task. Like, do you want to set up multi-link usage? Do you not want to allow multi-link connections? These multi-link connections are a way for a client to make multiple different connections into the same network. More often than not, these have to do with perhaps dial-up connections. You don't tend to see multi-link connections for too many network cards, especially at the client side. Down here also is the bandwidth protocol for reducing the number of connections from that client to this server if the total amount of bandwidth drops below a certain percentage. Do you want to identify IP filters here? These are the IP filters that we configured or could have configured as part of the wizard. Do you want to set up encryption policies? Again, the same configurations here that we set up in the wizard as well. And then lastly, the IP settings that we want to configure here for the clients coming in. This configuration determines how that incoming client receives whatever internal IP address it requires. That can be chosen by the server itself, or by the client, or the server settings that determine the IP address management. Remember, back over on our RRAS server, we have configured DHCP delivery of those IP addresses. So this configuration here will ensure that any client coming in will get their actual IP address from that DHCP server.